I thank the representative of Bolivia, and I now give the floor to the Syrian Arab Republic.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Article 2 of the United Nations Charter in the first, fourth, and sixth paragraph stipulates that the United Nations is based on the principles of the sovereign equality of its members, and that members of the United Nations in international relations will refrain from resorting to force or the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, and that no provision of the Charter authorizes the United Nations to intervene in affairs in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state. Likewise, the adoption by the Security Council on Syria, dating 29, calls upon all to respect the sovereignty of the Syrian Arab Republic, to uphold its independence and territorial integrity, and the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter. Presently, we have the right, as do all persons throughout the world who believe in the Charter of the United Nations, we have the right to question what the Security Council has done to ensure that these purposes and principles be upheld, these purposes and principles that have been laid down wisely by the Founding Fathers to safeguard peace, security, and prosperity following the wars and tragedies that they endured. We are aware that in Syria, our country is not the first victim of breaches by members of the Security Council, breaches of the provisions of the United Nations Charter and international law. However, what Syria has been enduring is the consequence of silence in the face of these violations, silence over the course of decades. What has the Council done when these Security Council member states undermined the provisions of the Charter, when they stripped the Palestinian people of an opportunity to create an independent state with Israel as its capital? What was done when those same states breached the provisions of the Charter and invaded Iraq? What have they done when these same states destroyed Libya? What did they do when these states violated the provisions of the Charter and fueled global terrorism and fanned the flames of the jihadist movement? What did they do when those states flagrantly intervened in domestic affairs of states, when they plundered those states' resources, as is the case in a number of African countries? The animosity of some vis-a-vis my country stems from using the principle of law of the principle of force in breach of law and in breach of the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter, and in a manner that fails to uphold accountability following the laws of the jungle. Ladies and gentlemen, I wish to explain to you that the global war against terrorism, which my country has been waging, and to which my country has been subject for years, as some have been negligent, and some have passed these issues over in silence, swept them under the rug. Some influential states in the Council, and I'm speaking here about the United Nations, about the United Kingdom, and about France, they did everything possible to destroy Syria and the Syrian people, and to stand against those political positions, and to settle accounts with my state, to manipulate the provisions of the Charter, to violate the provisions of the Charter, to advance their short-sighted agendas, and this at the cost of the blood being shed by the Syrian people. These states have manipulated the media. Some exploited the United Nations to distort reality and to lie to international public opinion. With respect to the suffering inflicted by armed terrorist groups against Syrian civilians, these groups use civilians as human shields. They target hospitals. They target schools. They create training grounds in those areas, and they make them places of detention for people they abduct. And over the past 20 days, the city of Damascus has been subjected to 20 mortar attacks. It was shelled by 20 mortars. These states have manipulated the principles of the United Nations Charter when they issued orders for their regional partners to invest in media, to invest in material, to lend support to armed terrorist groups through the Fatah al-Hawaribi terrorists. They are using the blood of the Syrian people, are using open borders to facilitate transit of tens of thousands of mercenary terrorists from member states of this organization in Syria. And this leads to the creation of training camps in neighboring states. And these terrorists are being called the moderate Syrian opposition. Mercenary terrorists from more than 100 member states are now being called the moderate opposition. Their DNA has been changed, and has not rather been changed to make the moderate oppositions. My colleague mentioned that the interpreter has mentioned that Damascus was shelled, I said, by 1,000 missiles and mortars. Damascus was shelled by 1,000 missiles and missiles. It is an open secret. This support has cost $137 billion for such states, as was confirmed by the former Prime Minister of Qatar. And it is no secret to state that, as was mentioned by the ambassador of the U.S. in Syria, as was affirmed, that their country spent $12 billion over the course of 4 years, from 2014 to 2017, to change the government in Syria. The government in Syria does not. We see that the U.S. is looking to change power in Venezuela, in Iran, in our country. The WikiLeaks documents have revealed the practices of the successive American administrations, and they have been opposed to my country since the U.S.-British invasion against Iraq. These countries have manipulated the provisions of the Charter when they endowed armed terrorist groups with chemical substances, toxic chemical substances, to be used against innocent civilians. And subsequently, they manipulated the areas of those incidents, and they fabricated false information. They provided false testimony to accuse the Syrian government and to find pretexts to attack the Syrian government. There are 136 letters in this book, correspondence addressed to the Syrian government, with very important information contained about the possession of chemical substances by terrorists to be used in Syria. These substances were used in Syria, 136 letters on the chemical issue. You all have these letters, but nobody takes an interest in this kind of information except some, with the exception of some of you. Today, one of the most important political journals, an American journal, to it Newsweek, published an article which was written by Jan Wiki on 8 February entitled, "Now Mattis Admits There Was No Evidence Assad Used Poison Gas on His People." The U.S. Minister of Defense admitted that there is no proof whatsoever about the use of toxic gas by the Syrian government, neither in Khan Sheikhoun nor in Ghouta in 2013. Yesterday, the French Defense Minister, Florence Parly, also stated that there was no documented proof about the use of chlorine gas by the Syrian government. Yet, these remarks did not prevent the French president from threatening to stage an act of aggression against my country, as was done by the former U.S. administration. These states have manipulated the principles and purposes of the Charter when they sought to legitimize the recurrent attacks perpetrated by the forces of what is called the International Coalition under the umbrella of the United States. The most recent to date was the aggression perpetrated by this illegitimate aggression 8 February 2018 in Raif, Deir ez-Zor, and in northeastern Deir ez-Zor against the Syrian People's Forces who were fighting against Daesh. This region is under U.S. protection. This region is 65 kilometers wide. Daesh has entrenched its presence in the region with protection provided by the United States. And when the Syrian People's Forces attacked Daesh in that region, the U.S. Air Force shelled those Syrian People's Forces. And this is yet another reflection. And undoubtedly, this is yet another reflection of the genuine mission of this coalition and the role that Washington plays specifically in supporting the Islamic State, as has been done in the past when the United States targeted Syrian Arab Army sites in Jabal Tarra near Deir ez-Zor, 17 September 2016, which enabled Daesh to advance and to occupy those areas in Jabal Tarda. This coalition has deliberately destroyed 90% of the city of Raqqa. And this coalition seeks to neutralize has not failed to uphold its commitment to neutralize the mines left behind by Daesh. And we've seen the perpetration of terrorist attacks to serve the United States in the east of Euphrates and east of Afrin. In a statement by the special envoy, there was no mention made of the U.S. occupation of some regions in my country, nor the Turkish occupation of parts of my country. The special envoy mentioned that there was a transnational conflict in Afrin and that an illegitimate Turkish invasion is being used in my country, and that there was an aggression against a Syrian city called Afrin. Mr. President, these states have manipulated the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter when they remained silent, as did the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, with respect to the attacks staged by the Israeli occupation forces in areas in Syrian Arab Republic, specifically the 10 February aggression 2018. This was an act of aggression which my U.S. colleague attempted to justify by stating that this was a response to the flight of an overflight of an Iranian drone, overflight over occupied Palestinian territory. That is not the first time that we have borne witness to an Israeli act of aggression against my country. You all are aware that Israel continues to violate my country's sovereignty, and we have been conveying this information to you and to the Department of Peacekeeping Operations. These states have manipulated the purposes and principles of the Charter when they opposed the condemnation of terrorist attacks and the launch of 1,000 missiles and mortars. Most recently, they targeted cities, diplomatic missions, infrastructure, and churches in Damascus and in other cities. These acts of aggression claimed dozens of casualties, hundreds of people wounded including civilians, largely women and children. These states manipulated the purposes and principles of the charters when they promoted what is called besieged areas in eastern Ghouta, Arif, and Damascus. And they forgot that the residents of eastern Ghouta have been besieged from within by armed terrorist organizations who operate in that city, and they use civilians as human shields. They seek to control humanitarian convoys to divert them for the benefit of their supporters or to sell them to destitute people at exorbitant prices, as was the case in eastern Aleppo. Mr. President, when the United States of America decide to militarily, unilaterally, illegitimately intervene in my country, Washington, when the decision was taken, stated that the goal was to fight against the Islamic State. Subsequently, they changed their mind and stated that they were present in Syria to establish military bases, permanent military bases, to safeguard their strategy and that of their partners. Subsequently, they once again changed their mind to state that they were present in Syria to establish armed militias to oppose the Syrian government and to enable these militias to exploit hydrocarbons and other resources in Syria. Subsequently, they changed their thinking again, stating that they would remain in Syria even if Daesh were to be vanquished. They said the same thing about Iraq to justify their presence in that country. They also changed their minds and stated that they would only leave Syria if a settlement were to be arrived at. So then, they stated most recently that they were in Syria to fight against Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia, and they shifted their nuclear strategy and are considering the possibility of using nuclear weapons, and might even tell us tomorrow that they are in Syria to fight against Martians from the Milky Way. Sir, we commend the efforts undertaken by the Russian Federation, specifically the efforts undertaken by the President, Vladimir Putin, in hosting the Syrian National Dialogue Congress in Sochi. This conference in Sochi was yet another demonstration of the fact that the political process in Syria can only be done with Syrian oversight and without any foreign interference whatsoever. The participants in the conference represented all swaths of Syrian society, socially, politically, economically, culturally, and in other ways. And with the overwhelming majority, 2 documents were adopted, to wit, the final statement and the document calling for the establishment of a constitutional commission. I cherish the hope that the fruits of Sochi will not be misinterpreted. The final statement, which has been amended by Syrians who took part in this Congress, who adopted with a broad majority, there was a vote, a democratic vote that was held, pursuant to the procedures that had been established. So this final statement was subject to a vote, and this constitutes a pillar in the political process, which will give rise to dialogue or discussions in the future. And this rooted in a purely Syrian solution, a Syrian-led solution, absent any foreign interference. This communique is a legitimate foundation for any political process, especially in the light of the fact that it reflects national principles which are unanimously supported in Syria that are not up for consideration, to wit, respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity of Syria, the right of the Syrian people to choose their political economic system, and to respect the Syrian army and armed forces. Given the principle whereby Syrian people themselves are to decide their future and the structure of the constitution, participants in this conference adopted a resolution to set up a constitutional commission. The creation of this commission is to uphold this resolution, which set down the prerogatives thereof. This was a resolution voted upon by Syrians, and participants of the conference did not lend any authority for Mr. de Mistura to set up this commission. We, the people of Syria, are wedded to the decision, what was decided by the participants, and we will not deal in any way with a commission to be set up by any foreign stakeholder. The constitutional question is a governing question. The government of the Syrian Arab Republic was and always remains committed to a political settlement and to putting an end to the bloodshed in Syria in a manner that respects the sovereignty and independence of my country, and in a manner that will uphold the right of the Syrian people to decide their future through dialogue, through Syrian dialogue. And I emphasize this, through intra-Syrian dialogue. This constitutes a principle that is reflected in all Security Council resolutions. To conclude, I wish to respond to our U.S. colleague who mentioned that peace in Syria, that she was calling for implementation of Resolution 2254, resolution calling for respect for the independence of my country. If this resolution, which was approved by Washington, it confirms the importance of upholding the territorial integrity and independence of my country. What are the United States forces doing in my country then? Has the United States of America, is it not breaching this resolution, which was approved by the American delegation at this council, which was unanimously adopted? Thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative.